Hello, and welcome to this month's Synth Masterclass tutorial with computer music. This month, we're going to be using our ZebraCM plugin to create a classic clavinet and pianet sound, which was the kind of sound made famous by artists such as Stevie Wonder. We'll begin by loading a copy of the ZebraCM, and then performing an initialize. To initialize our patch, all we need to do is go to the display, which is at the very top of the plugin. This also acts as a menu, so when you click on it, you'll reveal a drop-down. If we come to the bottom, you can see it says Init for initialize. If we click on that, it'll initialize the patch. We'll also immediately turn down the volume of the plugin, and we do this by going to the bottom right-hand side where it says Master, and there's a pot immediately underneath it. If we click and hold on that pot and drag it to a position of around about 12 o'clock, if you look in the upper display, you should see it reads a value. The value that we want today is 50. However, it's worth pointing out that any time we make an alteration to any of the on-screen parameters, always look at the display at the top to get an accurate reading. We'll start creating our sound by going to oscillator number 1. The volume of oscillator number 1 is already set to a value of 100, and we can leave that where it is. However, we do want to change the waveform, which we're going to change to quite a reedy sound. Click and hold on the waveform display. Drag the icon upwards until you see a value of 9.80 in the upper display. You should then hear a sound like this. We're also going to set up a degree of modulation of this waveform. To do this, we go to the wave pot, which you'll find directly below the waveform display. We need to assign the pot to envelope number 2. We also need to change the value of the pot, which is the amount of modulation we're allowing, and we set that to a value of 1.5. Now we're going to move across to oscillator number 2. We're going to make some very similar alterations here, beginning with our waveform. If we click and hold on the waveform display and drag it to a value of 3.6. At the moment, we can't actually hear oscillator number 2 because the volume is turned down. So adjusting the volume control, set this to a value of 50. Worth noting that we're setting this lower than the volume of oscillator 1, because oscillator 1 is going to be the more dominant oscillator in this patch. One of the things we're attempting to achieve with oscillator 2 is create a good sort of sonic foundation, and one of the ways that we can do this is by thickening or aliasing the waveform. We do this by clicking on the number 2 so that we hear two waveforms at the same time. It's also a wise idea to detune those waveforms against each other, so moving to the detune pot, set this to a subtle value of just -2. We should now hear a sound like this. And if you listen really carefully, you can already hear that there's a degree of movement coming from oscillator 1. That's the modulation of the waveform that we set up previously. Next, we're going to move across to the filter section. But because we're creating a sound which is quite vintage in flavour, today we're going to use the filter which is described as Low Pass LP Old Drive. Once selected from the drop-down menu, you can then go to the cutoff pot and adjust that to a value of 131. We're also going to add a little bit of vintage distortion from the overdrive pot, so grabbing the pot, move that to a position and a value of 63. Now we hear a sound like this. Now, one of the traits of the keyboards that we're seeking to emulate today is that they were quite pianistic in their general sort of makeup and sound. Consequently, we need to make some adjustments in the envelope section to mimic the sort of thing we'd hear on an instrument of that kind. Beginning with envelope 1 will control the volume or the amplitude of our sound. We'll leave the attack phase set to a value of 0, but we're going to change the decay phase to a value of 68. That's a relatively generous setting, allowing the sound to decay away over a relatively long period of time. However, the one thing we don't want it to do is sustain, so taking the sustain pot, drag that all the way down to 0. We can then also leave the release pot where it is at a value of 15. So if you think back a couple of steps, you'll recall that one of the things that we did is set a modulation path on oscillator 1 so that envelope 2 is controlling the shape of the waveform. We now need to tweak the envelope 2 settings so that we get exactly the effect that we want. Once again, leave the attack phase set to 0, set the decay phase to a value of 28, set the sustain phase to a value of 0, and leave the release phase where it is at a value of 15. This means that what we have is the decay phase effectively applying a degree of decay in the direction of the waveform which is being modulated. Hence we get a sort of twang at the front of every single note. A little bit like a piano. That largely concludes the makeup of our actual synth patch. However, there are plenty of other things that you could consider doing. A surefire thing will be to use some form of compressor. We're using a Universal Audio 1176 shaped compressor today because it's quite vintage in flavour, but also because it's quite fast to react in terms of compression speed. We're also applying a little bit of back-end reverb using a plate reverb, also from Universal Audio. If you have a hunt around the plugins which are included with your DAW suite, you'll probably find something very similar to an 1176 compressor, and you should certainly find some form of plate reverb. Next, it's just down to you to create some funk nirvana. Until next time, we'll see you soon.